I always ask people to say their name, so we have it.
Ron Bechet.
Bechet, okay.
Yeah.
Struggle
Well,
with these names.
yeah, it's always a struggle, especially here in New Orleans, because it's passed down, and as it passed down, it's like that old thing. You tell someone, and someone tells someone, and by the time it comes back to you, it's completely different. And so through the generations, it's changed. So I have a great uncle who was a famous jazz musician, and so when I hear his name pronounced and it's spelled the same, and I said, okay, no, that's not quite the way I was taught how to pronounce it. And they say, Sidney Bechet, and so my family always taught. We were taught from our relatives Bechet, so.
So Bechet versus
Bechet, yeah. So it's an accent. I guess it's a French accent compared to, as we would say, coming to this part of the world, somewhat changed due to the sort of climate of everybody having a say in it, not just you anymore.
So how long have you lived in New Orleans?
My entire life. I went away from New Orleans to go to graduate school and to do a couple of, well, actually my freshman year in undergraduate school, and then that's been it. Ever since then, I've been here. So I'm a native.
So you were telling us about Ron Theron's art that's here, and you had started to describe the things that float.
Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit about the Xavier Gallery and exhibits, and then maybe his work more directly?
About the Rooted exhibit, our Roots exhibit. It's curated by one of our faculty members, Sarah Clunas, and she brought Ron Theron, myself, and Patrick Waldemer, who is a Jamaican artist, together because of the common sort of theme of spiritually being rooted in culture, basically as a sort of theme that she saw running through our work. And so my work and Ron Theron's work, you can see it more or less in the way physically, but you can also understand it when you see Patrick's work as well. So there's a physical understanding of rooted, but there's also a spiritual understanding and an intellectual understanding of it. And that's partially why this show is put together. So Ron Theron's work, particularly in the one, Things That Float, it was his way, I think, from what my understanding of it, from seeing it and talking to him a little bit, but more seeing it, is that it was a way for him to contextualize what happened for him and for his city in the aftermath of Katrina. And he actually found photographs that were literally floating. When he said he went back to his grandmother's house after Katrina on his bicycle to literally go and see what happened in the Ninth Ward after Katrina. That was the only way he can get back there was on a bicycle so far, and then he was able to find a sort of makeshift boat and get to the house. And when he got there, what he noticed, first of all, was that the photographs were floating in the living room. And he was able to collect a great number of those. And so for him, that memory, that recollection of seeing his family literally floating, in the living room of his grandmother, I imagine for him it was an extremely emotional experience. And so this sort of recreates some of that emotional experience that he went through in that moment in time that we all had to kind of deal with.
And your work that's in the same exhibit, would you describe a little bit about the roots and the spirituality in that?
Sure. I have for a number of years, I've been painting and drawing for quite some time now, it seems. It just goes away real fast. And I've been working with the idea of landscape loosely, and Louisiana landscape, for quite some time. Even when I went to graduate school. And the reason I came back home was I found myself actually dealing with light and the experiences of place, of this place, of Louisiana, and New Orleans specifically, in Connecticut, which did not work. So I decided I needed to come back home. And so I've been here ever since that experience. And so the idea of a light and shadow as metaphor for spiritual things, for the connection to my roots, my ancestors, or the things that are primary in the work. So the landscape itself becomes a metaphor for those things, for the spiritual nature of who we are, and for the understanding of basically the struggle for our humanity. So I guess that's loosely what they're about. And more specifically, they start to deal with things about my struggle and the struggle of what I know through using landscape, using these forms, metaphorically, and thinking about the ways that we struggle to understand our existence. And so for me, growing up here, life is about death, and death is about life. And that whole struggle, that whole circle is extremely important to understanding our existence. So culturally, celebrations for us in this place is so important. And also to the celebrations of things that we find across the rest of the country and the rest of the world kind of odd here in New Orleans. I just thought about, we had a St. Joseph's Day altar yesterday, and on campus, and the celebration, this sort of that came from Sicily, of celebrating St. Joseph's feast day. It's a very Catholic thing, and since we're a Catholic institution, I guess it's also part of it, and a somewhat Catholic city. This idea of celebrating St. Joseph's Day is kind of interesting. So not only is it a Sicilian sort of thing that we've kind of taken and made our own here, but also too, the Mardi Gras Indians celebrate St. Joseph's Night. So they come out in their full costume, their full suit on St. Joseph's Night. And it's a very important tradition to them. And so the only 3 times that they wear their suit before they're dismantled and taken apart is on Mardi Gras, St. Joseph's Night, and Super Sunday. And so it's really strange how those things kind of conglomerate and merge. And we had a priest come yesterday to sort of talk about the St. Joseph's Day altar. And he talked about the fact that in New Orleans, we really know how to do Lent, that we have, all these celebrations within Lent that are part of the tradition, but also to celebrate other people's tradition that we've kind of taken on and made it our own, and contextualize it to not only celebrate, but to reflect on our humanity. And so that's part of what I try and do too in my work.
So I'm curious about the Mardi Gras Indian connection to St. Joseph's Day celebration, so St. Joseph's Night. Do you know more about why that night and why that connection?
I don't know. And I'm not the only one. I think the Indians themselves don't really know. The Mardi Gras Indians don't know. And scholars have different interpretations of why that is, because of the time of when the Sicilians started to come to New Orleans from southern Italy. That it was a connection to the sort of rise of the tradition came to be the Mardi Gras Indians, and so that there may have been some sort of correlation between kinship of those two. You know, some of our early famous jazz musicians also were Sicilian. Louis Prima, for example. And so it's kind of interesting that, you know, we have those cultural connections among cultures that you wouldn't necessarily think had anything in common. But that's part of, you know, what I try and deal with my work too, is to understand, you know, what is the core basis of our humanity. And so, you know, despite difference. And so that's part of what I'm trying to struggle with as well.
And so the New Orleans celebrations are part of that, and the cultural activities. The people in New Orleans, how do they play into that?
Well, I think, you know, for my family, just in the way I grew up and where I grew up, you know, big family activities, there was always something on a Sunday or Friday. You know, it's either Friday fish fry, you know, during Lent, typically, or Advent. And my family was from a Catholic tradition, and we either had, you know, the fish fry thing or crawfish in season, or a big picnic, you know, in the yard on Sunday. And so that was at somebody's house, you know, and it would vary on which time of the season it was, and of course, you know, my family was fairly large, extended family, and so the gumbo wars too was always significant. You know, at the holidays time, you know, my mother and my aunt, three of my aunts, they would always compete for who had the best gumbo at the particular different holiday times, you know. So Christmas, my mother would do it, and then Easter, my aunt would do it, and so they would have the thing at their house, and so they would all have this sort of discussion after about who had the best gumbo this year, you know. So it was also competitive, and you know, and but I still think my grandmother had the best one. So and it's just you know, that kind of interest and creativity and nuance in how things are done in the context of a daily existence, I think is part of what makes this place so special. And so the people here, you know, we are Caribbean, I think, and primarily African. And the city of New Orleans has always been had African people here from its inception. So when, you know, Bienville came and met the people who are already here, and they told them where to kind of build a city, Bienville had Africans with him. And so it's always been part of the existence of New Orleans. And so I think that makes it also special. It makes it very Caribbean. And so we've always had this sort of mix of people in a port city. And it's only been able to bring in more people, and people are now still coming in, even today. So
our understanding from some of the other interviews we've had is that there are a lot of folks have moved to New Orleans after Katrina. Do you have any sense of how that's affected the culture, or is it affecting the culture, contributing, you know, negating, you know, however effect it might have?
yeah, it is changing, and some of it is changing for the better. Some of it, for my belief too, is some of it is not. But any culture must change in order to survive. You know, if it stays the same or stagnant, then, and the generations that come in don't have an opportunity to put their own stamp on it, then it dies. And so I think some of it is that, the new generations that are coming up are actually putting their understanding of what they see as humanity on it, and it's changing. And some of those things are good, and some of those things old folks like me think are not so good. But it's, I think, going to bear out over the long term. And we don't know what that's going to look like later on down the line. And, I think, for example, second lines, Mardi Gras Indians themselves, they're all cultures that have evolved to where we know them now from the past. And, one example might be with Tootie Montana. He's said to have changed the Mardi Gras Indian culture from actually fighting and competing in that way to competing in a way where they actually decide on who's the best looking, who's the prettiest Mardi Gras Indian, who's the one who has the most skill, rather than the one who can literally fight the best. And so I think that's a positive cultural change. But we'll see as we go through how those changes still take effect in the new generations. And some things that are problematic are, like everywhere in the country, the idea that people come in who don't understand the culture and want to think about how they can add to it, but not quite knowing how to, because they aren't aware of the history and aren't aware of the way that things are done here already. And some examples of that are people who move into Treme, and this is also some really important documentation of this after people began to come back after our big event in 2005. The musicians, when someone dies, the tradition had always been that the musicians come out at night and they play until they can't play anymore, and then they go home, and each night that happens until the funeral. And so this happened a couple of times, and people who weren't from New Orleans didn't quite understand it, and they called the police and said, these people are causing a nuisance, right? Not aware of this is a tradition that should be respected and understood. And it doesn't go on forever, right? And so they were concerned about something that really had no place in terms of their own need, but not understanding the cultural need or the need of the community to grieve. And so that caused a huge uproar, and still does in some cases. So in terms of some people coming in, and also too, I guess, the practical matter of people come in from places where, they're not understanding the cost of living here and the circumstances of someone's everyday life here. And going into a neighborhood that's a beautiful neighborhood, and then purchasing a house or something that's way beyond what the sort of average for a house is in a neighborhood, and of course raising the values. And so people who have been in that neighborhood for a long period of time can't afford to be there anymore. And so then what happens to those people who have been there and who have been there culturally for generations, and then now don't have a place? And so what happens in that circumstance? And then what happens too to that neighborhood? So those kinds of things, I think, too, are not only problems here, but problems across our country in urban areas where, are what we call gentrification now. So it has become an issue in this city as well, particularly in Bywater and Treme. So those kinds of places that now are culturally different because of those kinds of experiences.
Do you know, because we've heard a little bit about this, agreed, gentrification is happening worldwide apparently. But one of the things that struck me in the conversations we've had is that homes here are passed down from generation to generation, and quite often, like, going 150 years back.
Right, and sometimes without paperwork.
And yeah, and so I'm kind of curious if has there been any, especially with Katrina, when people lost paperwork, has there been any attempt to instate some sort of protection, some sort of laws or something that people who can establish, because everybody, I mean, we had, in my neighborhood, we had people who had been living there for, over 100 years, that had been passed down.
Right.
Is there any way to legally protect their rights to have that property? Has any of that happened?
Not that I'm aware of. There's been a lot of discussion about it, particularly in the Ninth Ward. And in the Ninth Ward, that was a community that, for the most part, was homeowners, and those houses were passed down. And so, when those houses are paid for, you really don't have to have insurance. And so, no one knew what insurance was, mostly in the Ninth Ward. And so, when we had that catastrophe, people lost their property because they had no proof to title. And so, and there really has not been any legal action that I'm aware of that has taken place to really help people deal with that kind of a circumstance. And other than there have been some lawyers and some not-for-profit lawyer-type organizations that have helped people actually get their title in order. But, no legislation, no city ordinances that have actually done anything about that I'm aware of.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you as an educator, how do you view, what is your perspective on education in New Orleans and working at an HBCU? I mean, what would you want people who aren't from New Orleans to know about education in New Orleans, and then also maybe the connections to Xavier?
Yeah. Well, we've my children, my daughter was in high school in 2005, and just before then, in 2004, we had the state takeover of New Orleans schools, which was called the RSD, and the RSD came in and took over through legislation those schools that were failing. And so when Katrina came, they were able literally to fire all the teachers across the Orleans Parish, and still there has been no, how should we say, they were career teachers. There's been no reconciliation, there's been no understanding of what actually happened with that. And so today, we have a sort of interesting mix of things that happen in K through 12 in New Orleans. And we have different, these sort of organizations that come in, these educational organizations that come in and run particular schools by charter, either through the state system, the RSD system. The Recovery School District is actually what that stands for. Okay. And then we also have those that are chartered by our Orleans Parish School Board. And so we have a mix of chartered schools. And some are okay, and some are just absolutely horrible. And so there's no continuity for young people. And so first you have this trauma that happens, and then you build on that trauma by not having any stability for these students. And so this continuation of this trauma is actually showing up now. It's showing up here when they come to university, or if they can make it to university. And that trauma has not been dealt with. And so we have all of these young people who basically are dealing with this trauma however they can. And of course, it's showing up in ways that are not very healthy for our society. in our culture. We see them in the criminal justice system. And New Orleans, this area of the country, and we see it we call it Louisiana, but most of the people come from this area that end up in the criminal district, in the criminal justice system, has the highest incarceration rate of anywhere in the world. And so we are not doing something right. And we're criminalizing in as early on as school. So we have 6 and 7-year-olds that are being arrested in schools for basically kid-type behavior. And we have no way of dealing with it in a consistent way. So those teachers who knew how to deal with that, who knew how to deal with kid behavior, are gone now. That we have no really career teachers anymore in the school system, from what I can see. They come and they go. So we have young people who are basically teaching young people who have no experience at teaching. And so teaching has not become a career, it's become a job. And unfortunately, it's really starting to show up. And I guess this is one of my pet peeves about how we treat young people in the school system. My wife is very involved. She actually runs an organization that deals with mitigating suspensions and expulsions in schools. And that's really important work, I think, that she does. And it's really traumatic, I think, not only for those kids, but for their families. And so we're not really teaching them, we're housing them. And so when behavior becomes a problem, where normal behavior becomes a problem, where they basically are able to criminalize these kids based on something that's an expected child behavior or adolescent behavior, then we have problems with ourselves, not necessarily with those kids. So I'm sorry, this is a really...
Yeah, what is the organization your wife runs? If you don't want to say, that's fine.
Yeah, it's called CRA, and I always get the initials mixed up, so bear with me on this one. Center for Restorative Approaches is what it's called, and she uses restorative approaches as a technique in schools to deal with young people, with whoever. So basically the premise is that the people who may be offended and those people who are doing the offending come together and decide on how to deal with that. And so that's the important part. And so she's been trying to work with schools and with organizations and anyone really on how to use that practice, that technique, in order to deal with problems, rather than to allow the criminal justice system to get involved. And when that happens, it becomes very serious. And sometimes, a student, a young person, or whomever cannot recover from that because it becomes a criminal situation, rather than something that can be solved and negotiated and dealt with in a way where it's restorative, rather than criminal.
Yeah, we could probably talk a lot about that. And
Oh, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about working at Xavier and the students that you see.
Well, obviously, Xavier gets students from all over the country and all over the world, too, but half of them come from New Orleans. And there is a difference, in that aspect of trauma that I think is interesting to see in the New Orleans students. But we have changed too, and we have dealt with issues that have to do with looking at justice. And Xavier's mission is actually to prepare leaders for a more just and humane society. And so in that work, we have found that, working within communities and with structures in the communities, a lot of our departments and our professors actually do that kind of work now. And so it's changed to where we actually are using that technique more often, even in our art department. We are known for having students, particularly African American students, go into medical schools from Xavier. So actually we are the #1 ranked college to actually do that. And we also have a pharmacy school. And so we are all making that adjustment to how do you work with and through community in order to teach and prepare students to do those kinds of things that are mission related. And so it's been very important for us, the changes that the university has made. And obviously physical changes since Katrina, but also to the structural and changes in curriculum that have been made as well, based on what we know from that traumatic experience.
So good's come out of some of the
Yes, yeah, a lot of good.
trauma.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, a lot of good. And we're very fortunate to have students be able to come, use that trauma, and understand how to use it to become restorative, and also think about it in terms of reconciliation and what that means. So it's been really good in some ways, and really, a lot of work in trying to figure that out in other ways. And we're still figuring it out.
So these communities, are there partnerships with other educational institutions and or organizations in New Orleans?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the interesting collaborative things that came out of it was we now have this relationship with Tulane, Loyola, and Dillard, where students can take classes at any of the universities without having to pay a fee. And so you can take a class, a Xavier student can take a class at Tulane or Loyola or Dillard, and vice versa. And so that's something that didn't happen before. And it's brought us closer together as institutions. So those, the private institutions. And we also do have better relationships too with other institutions that are in the city. It's brought us closest to centers and to grassroots organizations and people who are developing these new organizations, like my wife, And so we have had students leave the institution, leave Xavier, and develop organizations that are doing similar work. And so it's kind of really interesting to see how, I guess now after I've been at Xavier for 17 years and starting to see some of the students actually do things that are really interesting. And we have one of our students from the art department who went on and got his master's, his MFA in theater from the art department. And he still paints, and his wife's a painter too, and she's a graduate of our program as well. But he runs an organization now that's called Liberty's Kitchen. And they literally take kids off the street who have had issues with school and issues with traumatic experiences that can't really go on. And so they brought them in, and through the training in working in food, and that they actually use that as a training method to actually get these kids prepared and culturated and be able to work and be able to get a job and be able to do things that are contributing to society rather than taking. Mm-hmm. And so we're really proud of him, and so and his wife. And
what is his name?
Dennis Bagnaris, and so he's really a special guy, because literally he's out there with the kids on the that people are kind of not dealing with, and pushing on the side, and bringing them back to show them that there's another way of doing things rather than the ways that they've sort of developed on the street. Mm-hmm. And so we've had, a few examples like that of our students across the university that have gone out and done some really positive things.
And we've heard a lot about art co-ops. Are there
Mm-hmm.
some that are more focused toward youth?
Yes.
Okay.
There's some Kids Smart,
Kids.
and they're actually their thing is to literally work within, and it was founded by two artists, a couple, and they literally focus within the schools on bringing teachers, both classroom teachers in art, but also too using art as a tool within the school to teach other things. And so that's their main focus, is to use arts, and it's not just visual art, but it's all the arts in that manner. And so that's one that's really thrived after Katrina. They actually were before, but then very young early on, and then now has really taken off after.
Awesome.
We have several co-ops of just artists who get together and find a space and run a gallery, basically an artist-run co-op. And there's one that I'm a board member of, Antenna Works, which started, after 2005. It started in 2006 and has grown to this wonderful organization that has done things in both writing and also too in visual art. And working with young people, something that came out of it that's now its own organization is called Big Class.
One more time.
Big Class.
Big Class. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And Big Class is a writing group, and their way of helping young people through writing is kind of really innovative, I think. And so, there's some really interesting organizations that have come up out of this, out of these collaboratives and cooperation between groups and people who trying to make a difference. And so it's really exciting. And in some ways, the whole St. Claude Arts District has come up after Katrina, and it's come up through people that are from here and people who've come in after. And what's interesting is that in the aftermath of Katrina, there were a lot of young people who came from universities, et cetera, to come in and help with the cleanup and help get New Orleans back on its feet. And a lot of them have stayed or come back and helped to develop this place into something that's growing and changing and morphing and moving around. And so, like I said earlier, some of it is positive and some of it is not, but at least something is happening, and we're all having to deal with it in some ways, and hopefully we're all looking at it, as positive experience, one way or another. And what's really nice is that people are pushing and and moving and trying to have a voice in it, and even our mayor has done some really interesting things recently. And so I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with what's going on with our Confederate monuments.
We heard a little at the Gentile Cafe where we've been
Okay.
getting breakfast most mornings, but it's been just snippets.
Mm-hmm.
So fill us in.
Well, it's our mayor, within sort of the aftermath of what happened with the church killings in South Carolina, thought about it and said, we really have these, and he's had a lot of pressure, and other mayors and so on have had a lot of pressure about, particularly for Confederate monuments that have really been sort of done after Reconstruction, and have been there and been sort of offensive to the African American community for years. And so he thought about it and said, well, we have these 4 monuments that we really need to deal with. And so he went to the city council and to the community and said, we're going to try and see what we can do with these 4 monuments to take them down. And so there's been a huge conversation in the city and in the city council and et cetera to deal with this. It's been going on for about heavily for 2 years. And it's been in the courts and so on. And we've had a group of young people, primarily young people, but also to some folks my age, who are also involved in a movement called Take 'Em Down NOLA. And so it's been very interesting to look at some of these movements in the city that have organized people and organized people around issues primarily, but also to just to have people come together around something positive. So there are, factions who believe certain things, and so it's been interesting to deal with that. And so what it's brought up too is a wellspring of dealing with the racial issues in our city. And so it's brought some of it to a place where it can be dealt with. And so the mayor also had an initiative where he's actually helping people to come together around issues of race and reconciliation. So it's been a sort of a catalyst too for us to kind of start dealing with that, and start dealing with it. And of course, well, we nationally we've had some issues, but here in New Orleans, to start dealing with it in an organized way, it's been kind of interesting. And of course, it's still controversial. There are a lot of opinions, and all of them, are valid in some ways about points of view and stances. But finally, I think the courts have decided that the city has the right to take down those monuments. And so they're supposed to be taken down pretty soon and put in storage. And they're, two of them are in prominent places. Where people, visitors who come actually see it and so on. And so it is positive, I think, in that we are starting to deal with, our past and how it affects where we are now. And so it's a really, I think, a significant thing to start thinking about racial reconciliation in light of institutional racism and those institutional issues that we've been dealing with for quite a number of years, and it's held us all back,
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, I know I was going to forget who to attribute this quote to, but basically it goes that, to hold me down in the mud, you have to be there with me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that, I think, for me, has a lot of meaning. Until we all uplift each other, we all going to be in the mud.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's the way I see what's going on now.
It's actually really optimistic thinking about bringing issues to the surface where they can get resolved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The way you said that was very encouraging.
Oh, I'm encouraged.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. So I'm curious, one of the reasons we started this project is because, I think I told you, friends of mine said they didn't have a voice,
Mm-hmm.
and the media was portraying them certain ways, and you've said
Mm-hmm.
a lot of very interesting and encouraging and also real things
Mm-hmm.
already. But is there anything you haven't said that you would want people who are not from New Orleans or who have never been to New Orleans to know
Mm-hmm.
about this geographic location?
Yeah, it's, I don't know how to say it other than New Orleans is more than just the French Quarter. And it's more than just, partying on Bourbon Street. And as a matter of fact, you ask, I think, most people who are from New Orleans, they don't even deal with Bourbon Street. There's just so much of it. You mentioned Gentilly, there's so many beautiful things, areas, places, significant ways of thinking about living in New Orleans that I think are special. And I think we sort of get categorized in Bourbon Street and Mardi Gras. And there's so much more than that, that this place is a very spiritual place. It's a place of a very special history, and something that I think that has a contribution to make to this country, that and needs to be brought to the light about ways that we've been able to manage and live in this place. And I think it's a good lesson for the rest of the country in some ways. And we do have a whole lot of problems, that particularly around, we talked about education, we talked about the fact that, we incarcerate more people than any place in the world, particularly black males. But I think that, there's some things that we have to work on and learn from that are things that can be translated to the rest of the country.